All right. Well, thank you to those of all who have come by. I'm assuming we're going to get some more as they trickle in from the previous session. Um, my name is Brian Weeden. I'm a Director of Program Planning with the Secure World Foundation. We are a Colorado-based nonprofit that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of space. I work in our Washington, D.C. office and focus quite a bit on issues related to space debris, space situation awareness, and the topic we're going to talk about today, space traffic management. So I think as we've seen sort of reflected through some of the previous sessions at this conference, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in space. We're currently seeing a growing number of countries that are getting involved in space for a wide variety of different activities, but also a growing number and complexity of commercial space activities are starting to happen. And these are not only, kind of more of the same, things like remote sensing and communications, but also new types of commercial activities, things like private space stations, satellite refueling, satellite repairs, other sorts of new activities. All this sort of new activity is generating increased amount of concerns about congestion in orbit, as some of these satellites are trying to be in the similar orbits or same locations, very large constellations. Also, the risk posed by the growth in human-generated orbital debris, the risk of collisions. So there's a lot of, in the public policy world, a lot of discussions about how do we ensure the long-term sustainability and safety of space activities as we start going through these changes and incorporating the sort of rapid growth in the number of satellites, types of activities. How do we prevent collisions that could create more debris? How do we ensure equitable access to space? How do governments provide oversight of commercial space activities? And how do we build towards sort of a more, I'll say, a more comprehensive space governance framework? So that is what we're going to talk about today, or at least one element of that, and that is something known as space traffic management or space traffic coordination. This is an idea and a concept that's been floating around for at least a few decades, but one that is still somewhat fuzzy with several different definitions floating around. And if you talk to, as we'll sort of get into, we're still sort of trying to work through what that means and what that looks like, and how to actually put it into practice. So today with me to discuss these issues, I have a great panel of experts. I'll ask you to raise your hand as I go around and introduce each of you. First, we have Mr. Dan Oltrogge. He's the director of the Center for Space Standards and Innovation, also the director of integrated operations and a space policy expert at the ComSpot Corporation, and a program manager at the Space Data Center. Dan has a long history as an expert in astrodynamics and working with the international standards community, author of many papers, and day to day works on some of these issues of how to keep satellites and other objects from colliding. We also have Dr. Sujai Shivakumar. He's the director at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, a Washington-based think tank where he's an expert in American technology and innovation policy, with nearly 2 decades of experience in directing studies, convening high-level dialogue, and preparing reports for various national academies. And then finally, I have Dr. Quentin Verspieren. He's a researcher at the Science, Technology, Innovation Governance Program at the Graduate School of Public Policy, the University of Tokyo. And yes, he is calling in today from Tokyo. We're very happy to have him as sort of getting his day started with a nice panel session. Quentin primarily works on space policymaking and technology development in developing countries and on international regime making for space safety and sustainability. He's also an associate research fellow at the European Space Policy Institute in Vienna, Austria, a fellow at the Japan Space Forum in Tokyo, and has, in his bountiful free time, consults with various companies and governments on on space systems. So I'm going to go through. I've got sort of a series of questions I'm going to walk through with our panelists, sort of have a guided discussion about these issues and tease out some of the big aspects, some of the different, commercial things, government, military, some of these aspects. And then we've got some more open-ended questions at the end. We definitely are going to try and incorporate your questions and thoughts as well. So as we're going through, feel free to drop it in the chat or if you'd like to make an intervention yourself, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll go ahead and call on you and give you the floor. So to get started, Dan, I was hoping you could sort of, begin with sort of expanding on some of the things I introduced at the beginning of what are we seeing? What are the changes we're seeing in the space domain? Just how many, more satellites and large constellations and new actors are there that are up there that are sort of driving some of this concern?
Yeah, in terms of changes, we have two key components. We are seeing a blossoming, a burgeoning active space population in ways we previously would have thought unimaginable. When I first got into space world, we were talking about a constellation of 4,000 satellites, and we said, that's ridiculous. It isn't even worth studying. But this is many decades ago, and now here we are. We have, we're well on the way in terms of large constellations. I have been characterizing how much is up in space using three-dimensional graphics. And as of, a couple months ago, you can now very clearly see the large constellation for SpaceX well established in this fabric of spatial density. So that's a huge change. We also, the second way is that we're also improving our knowledge of what's up there. We have commercial and national SSA systems and capabilities continue to improve. So this is stuff that's already up there, but we just don't know about it yet. And now we're starting to see it. So when you combine those two things together, the overall threat picture that we see is dramatically increasing. We recently, at the request of Space News, we went back and looked in our archives from CSSI and also from the Space Data Association. And we found that the number of conjunctions for the same miss distance in just the last 3 to 4 years has doubled from what it used to be. And so operators are having to sift through more and more conjunction warnings. And quite frankly, they don't have the SSA data, I think, necessary to do a good job of figuring out what to do. So those are the big changes I see.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. And just to kind of put a point on that, we're certainly seeing about over 1,000 Starlink satellites from SpaceX, which are nearly a third of the entire population of active satellites on orbit, which is, as you said, sort of unconceivable at some point, but not just sort of normal, just the beginning. Sujai, I'd like to turn to you. From a governance perspective, from a sort of a conceptual perspective, how should we look at space? How is it similar or different to other domains, air, maritime, ground transportation, where we have some of the same challenges of different users and economic use cases and congestion?
Thanks, Brian. I also just want to acknowledge the conference and the format that we're in. About 20 years ago, I had the good fortune to work with Eleanor Rostrom. And when this commission came up on space policy came up, when I was working at the National Academy of Public Administration, it was just a great occasion to go in and dig in again and really appreciate once more the power of her insights. So in economic terms, space has often been thought as a public good. So, for example, when a space satellite is placed in orbit, it moves in an elliptical path. And the enormous volume of space around the Earth, is believed to mean that the placement of satellite in orbit by a public or private actor would not really impede in any significant way the placement of a satellite in orbit by another actor. That view is now being challenged, as we heard just now. So although space is vast, some of the commercial usable venues are indeed limited, particularly in near Earth orbit. So congestion is the result that we see as new satellites and other assets and as you mentioned, debris crowd into specific Earth orbits and parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. So for these reasons, it may be more useful actually to think about some regions of the orbital space as a common pool resource, which again ties into the theme of this conference. So to be effective, any civilian agency that governs the orbital commons must really be able to overcome the central challenge of the tragedy of the commons. So as you know, the traditional approach to solving this predicament called for a CPR to be managed top-down by the state. This approach calls for the development of a centralized bureaucracy focused on a safety mission that can procure and field up-to-the-date technologies for space traffic management and coordination. But given the new realities of a differentiated and distributed space economy, which you alluded to, and the dynamism, frankly, of new space entrants who are making sizable investments with their own private resources, it's not really clear that a centralized approach to governing orbital space could be effective moving forward. So we are also actually witnessing a number of organizations that are self-organizing in terms of governance related to space commons. This includes the Space Safety Coalition, the Space Data Association, and I think the Consortium for the Execution of Rendezvous and Servicing, I think it's called CONFERS, I think. So it's a bit of a tongue twister. So anyway, the shift from private to hybrid priorities in space, I think is especially significant because commercial space's new leaders have sought to create a large-scale, largely self-efficient space economy, one that is fiercely competitive and resistant to a government-led regulatory approach. However, these actors also actually share a motivation to cooperate to avoid the steeply rising costs of operating in a space environment and thinking of the dangers from increased congestion. So the emerging approach, to conclude, is actually one that is user-driven, broadly market-oriented, but where the government frames and, if needed, enforces the rules governing the market with participation of the users to foster competition among firms, spur technological innovation, and sustain the CPR.
Thank you for that. And we're gonna, in a second here, we're gonna get to sort of the more specifics of what that might look like, because Sujai was involved in a pretty major study on this issue that came out last year. Quentin, I'm going to turn to you. We've talked so far about sort of the commercial uses of space, sort of a little bit of sort of the civil uses of space. The other aspect of this whole thing is the national security aspects of space, which of course is really important. It's been there since the very beginning. Can you sort of talk about what's going on there and how that sort of impacts how we might think about space traffic management and sort of space governance as a framework?
Yes, you're perfectly right. And it's true that in most of discussions related to STM, people tend to focus on the commercial and civil aspect, which is obviously the majority of objects in space in particular, since SpaceX is deploying this enormous constellation. But the fact is, even the origin of space technology is intertwined with military activities, and it was developed. Rockets were originally missiles, and the first satellites were mostly to look at what potential adversaries were doing. And still now, military applications of space technology are varied by combining remote sensing, positioning, navigation, and timing, communication. You can do reconnaissance, intelligence. All modern militaries use GPS or equivalent system to guide their missiles, their ships, their ground troops, their planes. So the space infrastructure has become a core part of how military power is projected. And in most modern militaries, military power cannot be projected without space, which is why these militaries, so US, European military, China, Japan, to a certain extent, have developed a large space infrastructure as well as means to monitor what is happening in space. So what Dan mentioned, this SSA, so Space Situational Awareness system. And now some of the leading militaries in the world have a huge infrastructure. So Dan can correct me if I'm wrong with the figures, he knows them better than me, but I think the US military has something for around 200 satellites, at least publicly acknowledged. China is supposed to have around 100, the Chinese military. So this is not negligible. The part of military assets in space is not the main one since SpaceX, but for a long time, the US military was the leading operator in the world. And so I think there is a double legitimacy of military stakeholders to involved in regime making. So I don't say rule making, because regime entail a lot of things, norms, principles, rules. And this double legitimacy is first the fact that they have a lot of assets. So they could be the primary losers of safety issues in space. They're the one having the most to lose, in particular organizations like the National Reconnaissance Office in the US, with their $1 billion assets all around the globe, would have a lot to lose from a cascading like chain reaction of debris generating more and more debris. And the second legitimacy they have is that leading militaries in the world have the technical knowledge on SSA, on astrodynamics, on basically all the technical basis of STM, much more than some of the leading civil agencies. So concretely, how does it manifest itself in negotiations for rules and principle? That's something that I spend years trying to investigate. And the fact is, at international level, militaries are not that visible, because it's inherent to the way we do diplomacy. You will not have a top-ranking American general going to the UN and saying we should do like this, or like this. But if you look more precisely how, let's say, a country like the US, France, or Japan, when they're going to the UN to discuss space-related issues, they come with an agreed national position. And the fact is, if you look how this national position was established domestically, in most countries, the military is playing a huge role with regards to space safety and sustainability. And in particular in the United States, where I could say that based on my research, the US military is definitely the leading actor in policymaking, space policymaking at domestic level. Then I think I've talked enough, and we can discuss later what it entails concretely on the content of the regime, what kind of input the military can make. But yes, they need to be included in the way we make regime, because they have assets and they're the one having the technical knowledge, apart from private actors like Dan's company.
It's a great point. I'd say just this afternoon, or this afternoon East Coast time, there was an announcement from U.S. Space Force that they're basically supporting the U.S. inputs on a current U.S. UN General Assembly resolution on what is responsible behavior, ISS norms of behavior, which I think is a pretty welcome sign, and sort of exactly what you said. That is the U.S. military is playing a role in how to craft that U.S. national response. So Dan, I want to go back to you. We sort of talked about a little bit about the problem was all these satellites, CubeSats, big constellations, lots of different people doing new stuff. Sort of think about space as a commons, also the national security benefits. By my estimation, most of the progress on what I'll call space traffic coordination and management, or space traffic management, has come in the private sector. We've seen some very interesting initiatives for sort of industry norms of behavior, sort of industry trying to get to share more data. Can you you've been involved in many of those, sort of unpack what some of those are and sort of the things that you're seeing sort of from the private sector side?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I have always viewed this whole long-term sustainability initiative as one that is comprised of both top-down and bottom-up contributions from the space community. The industry, commercial industry, civil, et cetera, has taken actually quite an active role going back to the SDA formation, Space Data Association, in 2009, and then beginning services now beyond its 10th year of operations. These are self-funded initiatives that commercial operators formed because they saw a gap there. They really weren't interested in doing this job, but they knew that they needed these capabilities to be as safe as they needed to be. So that's been a very good thing, I think. We also now have commercial SSA companies that are providing mature, highly available, and advanced SSA services. Those are starting to hit their strides, I think, and contribute to overall space safety. We have spacecraft operators and relevant industry stakeholders that have banded together, and I say banded, but really it's just assembling best practices and endorsing them and striving to implement them. So it's aspirational through the Space Safety Coalition that was formed about a year and a third ago. And that rapidly expanded from initially 18 companies now to almost 50. We're at 48 right now. So, you know, is this mandatory stuff these companies have to do? No, it's aspirational, but it's something where we can identify best practice, at least in the opinion of the people who are participating, and strive to implement as companies are able. So it's very complementary activities going on. I think that the commercial industry, especially in the US, is supported very well by the US government. And I think that there's been some nice collaborative efforts to investigate space safety and how we can make it better. The recent space traffic coordination and management demonstration we did, which brought together elements of the US government, the commercial operator community, as well as the commercial SSA community, showed very clearly that, you know, that sort of collaboration, including the commercial community, is really important and beneficial.
And just to put a point on it, most of these commercial stuff you're talking about, industry efforts, are not just U.S. companies, right? A lot of them include international companies as well.
Absolutely, yeah. The Space Safety Coalition has maybe 45% is U.S. companies, so it has 13 countries that have companies who have endorsed. So it's quite diverse. Space Data Association is based in the Isle of Man, and many of the operators are international. So that is a nice thing about the commercial side of things, is that we have a much more geographically diverse set of membership, and by its very nature then helps reflect a more diverse set of opinions. And when you build consensus among those players, I think you have a good basis for things.
So thank you. So I think I said again, but by my opinion, the most progress in this topic of space traffic management coordination is happening on the private sector side, as you just sort of outlined some of those. There is some efforts going on the government side, and I want to turn to you, Sujai, and because you know, and we're going to start with the U.S. government in part because they sort of already have the most well-developed national regime for licensing and providing oversight of capabilities and sort of SSA, space situation awareness, for tracking what's going on in space. And you were one of the co-authors of a recent study, commercially mandated study, that sort of looked at what more can the U.S. do. So I wonder if you could sort of recap what your findings were. Well, recap sort of what the state of things are of the U.S. government, and sort of what you guys found and what your recommendations were.
Certainly. So the National Academy of Public Administration was asked by Congress to conduct a review of which civilian agency in the federal government is actually best suited for the responsibility of space traffic management. So as you know, commercial actors increasingly view the DoD surveillance regime as a surveillance and warning regime as inadequate to achieve safe operations in today's commercial space environment. They see it as a legacy system that is tied to a sensor network with software geared towards the system's original national security purpose of providing early warning for a nuclear missile attack. Meanwhile, as we've discussed, the space economy continues to expand, and this is creating new pressures in the orbital environment. And as Dan just mentioned, commercial space operators are turning to services of a growing space safety industry to provide surveillance and warning systems needed to achieve safe operations. At the same time, DoD in recent years has sought to refocus its core missions in security and defense. And for these reasons, DoD is really seeking to exit its role in directly supporting the civilian space sector. And this shift has been revealed in the recent policy directives as well. So the entry of these new commercial actors, the shift in priorities at DoD, the question is, who's going to take over these STM responsibilities? Currently, a number of federal agencies have responsibilities pertaining to the domain of space, This includes NASA, the Air Force, or now the Space Force, the Federal Aviation Administration, which is with the Department of Transportation, and the Office of Space Commerce, the Department of Commerce, and that's just a partial list. In light of the complexities and diversity of the STM tasks and functions, the panel of the Academy concluded that it was actually difficult to make a simple statement that one agency should take this function, and instead call for what you might call a more polycentric approach. So in this context, the Academy panel found that the primary aim of the civilian agency coordinating space traffic management should be to advance the commercial and research uses of space separate from that of space, of the space domain, in that and with its focus on national security. So this, the panel called on the agency to focus on three things. First, working collaboratively with actors engaged in this domain, both public, private, domestic, and as we mentioned, international. Second, to enhance the safe orbital operations in this increasingly congested environment, and also to foster innovation in a growing space economy. And third, it said that it should lead domestic and international efforts to basically form the rules of the road, if you will, that can build a safer operating environment for the diverse set of actors in space, particularly near orbital space. The Academy panel also, ultimately determined that the Office of Space Commerce at the Department of Commerce is best suited to perform these space traffic management activities within the federal government. And it cited the fact that OSC, the Office of Space Commerce, viewed its space traffic management responsibilities principally as a data management function rather than a task of managing space traffic per se. Furthermore, its operating plan was to move forward. Its operating plan to move forward was not defined by a vision to build a centralized bureaucratic command and control structure, but rather it sought to serve as a sort of a trusted convener and coordinator of a larger domestic and international community of public and private space actors. So the other candidate, which was sort of in the front running, was actually quite a study in contrast. So which is that the FAA proposed replacing the centralized STM function, which was being carried out within the Department of Defense. And this, but the panel decided that this approach wouldn't really take into account the dynamism of the space economy, that the participant of new entrants and the rapid technological innovations taking place in this arena. It also, I think, a centralized bureaucracy, they feared, also risks sort of freezing a technology in place, potentially stymieing the growth of the space economy. So it is basically the Academy was mandated with picking an agency, and so they examined the state of affairs, understood what the new dynamics were in play, and ultimately determined that the Office of Space Commerce should be the lead agency in a sort of a networked approach to this challenge.
Yeah, and what's interesting to note is that since then, as the report came out, it was sort of noticed by Congress. At the end of last year, Congress did pass some legislation to authorize Department of Commerce to start a pilot program along the lines of what you just mentioned on sort of space traffic coordination, sort of taking over some of those civil functions, and allocated a little bit of money, about $10 million for that. But they did not give the Department of Commerce broader regulatory authority over commercial space activities, which I think is another piece of this. In addition to sort of the monitoring of things, there's sort of the regulatory authority, and that's also an important part of this, and one that we still really haven't addressed. That. Have you have any other comments on that piece of it at all?
I think there is. I don't understand entirely what the politics are, but I think, at least in terms of conception, the idea of a command and control approach is something that people can more closely relate to. This idea of of a more polycentric approach, looking at how do you connect agencies across the government, a variety of private sector and public-private associations into a broader network of a system where you sort of jointly, figure out what the rules of engagement are, and build a ecosystem for a innovative and expanding economy is something that is perhaps a little harder to grasp.
Yeah, trying to figure out the politics of how the U.S. Congress doesn't do something is definitely a very high challenge problem. So Quentin, the U.S. government is not the only government thinking about this. And then you've done some research on Japan and Europe. Let's to give us a quick overview of kind of how some of the other governments are thinking about this issue of space traffic management.
Yes, that's true. Many governments are thinking about space traffic management, but from the start, I would say that none of them has reached a level of understanding of the concept similar to the understanding in the US government, and also to the importance of the discussions on STM in these countries. So, but overall, if you look around the world, there is some kind of overall agreement on the principles. Generating less debris, trying to share information about what states or operators are doing, which is visible from the state side, but also the commercial side, like for the Space Safety Coalition, these kind of initiatives are more and more active. What may show some differences is more like kind of lower level rules, technical standards, that may, in particular, industrial standards that may see some fight between different industrial blocks. So I would say from the start, I don't have much information about Russia and China, so don't ask me too much detail about that. I don't know anyone who has information about that anyway. So talking a bit about Europe. So Europe should be understood as usual at two levels. You have what the states are doing, and this you have a lot of important space powers, such as, I would say, in order, France, Italy, Germany, Spain, that have their own views on the issue. Particular France is an important view because they have the main European launch base. So all the licensing process to launch satellite based on European launcher has to go through the French licensing process. But maybe what it's more interesting for you now is, what about the EU? What is the EU doing with regards to space traffic management? The first approach since a few years in the EU is to first build the technical capacity. And then on top of the technical capacity for monitoring space, trying to think about what kind of rules and standards the EU can diffuse around the world. And this is what is called the EU SST. So space SST, space situational, space tracking.
Surveillance and tracking.
Space surveillance and tracking, sorry, I totally blanked early in the morning. And so this is an institutional framework to kind of unite the capabilities of different states. And it's very different in approach to what you've heard about what the US government wants to do with the open architecture data repository, which wants to fuse source of data and try to put a lot of data that can be compared and merged. In the EU, the approach is more to have a centralized catalog. So the EU SST would fuse institutional data to make a single European catalog. So the approach is radically different. In terms of the policy side, the EU doesn't have a clear vision for now. There are even some kind of competing initiatives, some announcement by the European External Action Service, so the EU diplomacy, some other announcement by the European Commission. So it's a bit confusing for people outside the EU, even inside the EU, trying to understand what the European Union is doing. But one very positive thing is that as part of the Horizon 2020 program, which is how the EU funds research programs, it's like tens of billions of euros of funding every couple of years. The European Commission decided to fund 2 studies on, I would say, defining a European vision on STM. And these two studies are led by two different organizations with their own consortia. And I am part of one of these with the European Space Policy Institute. And we really hope that it could help have a more unified vision of the EU, and so that the EU can really make a good input in international STM discussions. Then you have countries, you mentioned Japan, that also don't really know where they are going in terms of STM. But contrary to the EU that wants to have its own vision, Japan tends to be in a more reactive posture to what the United States will be doing. And I think that there are many countries like this. So I remember discussions in the Japanese government of whether the Ministry of Economy should be in charge of STM so they can link well with the Department of Commerce. And if by any chance the new administration in the US suddenly decides that it would be the FAA, then probably the Ministry of Transportation in Japan would start to think more carefully about this. So it's also still blurred. The only specific field in which Japan focuses some efforts now in terms of STM is on-orbit servicing and active debris removal, because of one specific industrial champion that they have, which is called Astroscale, that wants to do active debris removal and on-orbit servicing. And so Japan needs to concretely figure out how to license Astroscale at some point, so they can work properly. And finally, the third category that is often not mentioned in discussion is emerging space countries, or countries that have not access to space yet, but that want the environment to be preserved. So if one day they have their own rockets, they have their own satellite, they can enjoy the same benefits that were enjoyed by the US, Europe, and Japan, let's say. And the question for these countries is how to accompany them in developing good practices. So it goes both ways. So how they can push leading countries to care about the long-term sustainability of space so they have a chance to benefit from it someday, but also how can leading countries help them to develop good practices so when they launch a satellite and they operate it, they do it properly. And this is something that is not well investigated yet, and that I encourage everyone to start looking at how to do this, I would say, norms diffusion from leading actors to emerging ones. And just to, I will put my scholar hat for a minute. There is this concept that was developed around Europe and around the European Union promotion of the abolition of death penalty that is called normative power. So it's a power that doesn't express it through the military or through the economy, but through values and norms. And there are interesting frameworks based on the theory of normative power that can help understand the ways to diffuse STM norms. And in particular, there's a scholar called Ian Manners that in 2002 developed a very interesting framework with kind of 6 arrows on how to diffuse norms. And I wrote down 3 that I felt were quite relevant for STM. One is called informational diffusion, which is basically the diffusion through communication of strategies and declaration, which is something that is done extensively already in STM. Procedural diffusion, that is diffusion through the establishment of cooperation. So this can include what some countries are doing when a developing country wants to have their first satellite. They will partner with a university or a space agency in the leading country that will share knowledge, technologies to help them develop. So procedural diffusion. And then the transference is the final form of diffusion I want to mention, which concerns the exchange of good, trade, and also aid. Aid is kind of included in both categories. So how also industrial relations can help diffuse these norms. And so it's just the beginning of thinking about this, but it will be critical because after great initiatives like the LTS guidelines, The issue will be to make sure that everyone integrates those big principles and ideas into their national legislation, because in fine, it's what matters, and national legislation and practices, and so how to diffuse these norms.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think I want to get to that in a minute here. I want to talk about sort of how that was done in the air traffic world and maybe what lessons there are for space. But I first want to turn to some of the questions we've got in the chat. There's a question here from Pankaj that I think I'll start, and I'll ask maybe Sujai if you could jump in on it. He asked sort of what is the role of the Space Force in sort of this whole issue of space sustainability, space security, space stability. I'll start just by kind of sort of pointing out that sort of so as somebody who used to work in the Air Force Space Command, the Space Force is basically that with a different label, right? So they took a bunch of people that were working for the Air Force doing space, and they changed uniforms, changed patches, and they gave a new title, and now they're trying to figure out what they're all going to be doing. So we're not really sure where things are going to go in the future, but as turns right now, sort of you know, they still are the sort of the primary source of a lot of the data that is publicly available on conjunctions and things that are going on in orbit. That is sort of the basis for all this sort of space traffic management congestion issue. So Sujai, I don't know if you want to expand on that at all, anything you guys sort of saw in your study as you sort of looked at roles and responsibilities, if you thought about, you know, what the military sort of does now and might do in the future.
Yeah, so I think what one of my colleagues mentioned this idea of a data repository a little bit earlier. So I think one of the things that you know, obviously the Space Force wants to get out of the business of providing warnings for the civilian sector, as I mentioned earlier, but they will, I think, going forward, will be interested in providing data along with data to this repository, along with which will also receive information from private satellite companies that track satellites, either through radar or telescopes. And you know, the challenge then is to how do you bring all this information under a common denominator, and also how do you create the rules within which innovators can come use that data and create interesting, you know, innovative solutions to challenges of space traffic coordination. So one of the advantages of this approach that the Academy panel endorsed was that it was more forward-looking and more, had the capacity to create, innovative solutions to these problems rather than fix a technology in time, especially given the fact that this is a very rapidly evolving industry. They feared that this would actually stifle the industry. Rather, one approach would stifle the industry, the other approach would actually help to create more opportunities within that industry.
Yeah, it might come as a shock to some, but this is one of like many examples where the U.S. military is actually kind of behind the times. One of the big drivers, I think that you guys looked at it, I've looked at my own research of why to shift this space traffic at this SSA and eventually space traffic management from the U.S. military to a civil agency is, as you just mentioned, sort of the rate of technological innovation needed to keep up with what is happening. The military just can't handle it, right? Because they have very long, sort of very deliberative procurement programs, and doing that, particularly for software, is just very, very difficult for them. So I think that's, and as you said, you know, we sort of need to bring data from all kinds of parties. Got to bring data from academia, from the scientific community, from NGOs, from the commercial sector, from other governments, kind of put it all together. Again, the Department of Defense is not great at doing that. They have other things they're good at, but that's not one of them. Dan, I want to turn to you for another question we've got here. So this trade-off between orbital concentration and space safety. I think the gist of the question is, you know, SpaceX is putting up large constellations, but they're concentrated and they're all sort of controlled by one operator. And so is there some benefit in having things concentrated under active control by one entity versus sort of much more distributed kind of around? Is there a trade-off there?
Certainly there is. I noted with interest, OneWeb had a philosophically different way of designing their constellation than SpaceX. frozen orbits are slightly eccentric orbits that you can nest, like a Russian nesting doll. And you can stack them and have a really good safe operations, such that if one of those satellites or some in a given shell fail for whatever reason, they'll not interact with other shells for at least a while, giving time to respond. And so a lot of operators, people don't realize, a lot of operators today, Iridium and others, are nesting these orbits very successfully to avoid interaction. I think to address the question, part of it is that yes, you can be an island where you stake out a given chunk of territory, and maybe in addition, you can nest your orbits with those around you. You can coordinate and be safe. I'll note, in terms of the distribution, the density of objects up there, there's a free website that we at ComSpot Corporation have available. It's called NEAT, N-E-A-T, Number of Encounters Tool. So it's at comspot.com/NEAT. And what you see in there is a very interactive graphic display of spatial density in the form of how often you come close to something else as a function of the inclination of your orbit and the altitude you're at. So there are very well-defined areas where you're going to have a lot of conjunctions if you're in that particular altitude and inclination space. And so that's with the debris that's there now. So now you might say, well, okay, maybe if I'm putting up a new system, I need to avoid those peaks and hopefully still accomplish my mission. And so, those are the games you can play to try and keep things safe. But yes, there's some aspect of staking out territory and operating in that space, while at the same time realizing other operators are going to have to slowly move through you if they're in low thrust objects. Over.
Yeah, and to sort of add to the complexity and sort of one of the big differences between the space domain and the air domain is you also have tens of thousands or more of uncontrolled objects, i.e. space debris, that are whizzing around at different altitudes. And those are not coordinated, they're not controlled. And so as much as you can do to kind of control things and create sort of a managed framework and communicate with the neighbors, you've got to deal with all this trash flying around. And it's, it's something else that you've got to factor into your calculations. So sort of that a hook. Quentin, I want to go back to you. There's and ask sort of, you talked about sort of the diffusion of norms. In the air traffic world, we do this because there is something called ICAO, an International Civil Aviation Organization, that sets global standards for air traffic that are then implemented by national administrations through national licensing. Do you think that is an appropriate framework and where we should be headed in the space world? Or do you think there's something unique about space that says that's maybe not the right solution?
So, I mean, on top of what you just said about the differences with air and space traffic management, I believe it is not the right approach, because it is an approach of management. And space traffic management has nothing to do with management, or should have nothing to do with management, for a simple reason, which is that management, at least in the contemporary meaning of the word, suppose an idea of effective control and some kind of overarching authority telling you do this, do not do this, or whereas what we see, and it was perfectly explained by my two colleagues, it's just about sharing information, discussing, sharing good practices, operational practices. So Space Safety Coalition, Space Data Association are a perfect example of that. And so I really don't see it as a centralized management system. And every time I'm in a panel or I make a keynote, I always say the same thing, but we should look at history to get good lessons. And I actually discovered recently, where does management come from? The word management. And it comes from an old French word that moved to the UK in the medieval era, and it's ménagement, which in French, if you look at 19th or 18th century dictionary, is defined as the art of conducting, leading, or steering. So not controlling, it's already quite different. And when you look at the verbal form itself, it means, so to manage, ménager in Old French, would mean to employ or spend with economy, like they use the example of a well-managed household, or treat with special care or consideration, which links to the concept in space law of due regards. It's also used with caution and circumspection, or prepare something with skill and restraint. So I would say that space traffic management should be space traffic management in this kind of old medieval understanding. So this idea of caring and sharing and having due regards for the environment and other actors, but not management as control.
No, it's a great point. And Dan has made this point separately. We only got a couple minutes here, so I'm going to quickly summarize that. Dan, you were leading an effort at ISO to maybe do a standard on space traffic management, or start some of that. And one of the challenges you got was, what is it called, right? You get a whole dispute over, is it space traffic coordination? Is it space traffic management? You guys settled on space traffic coordination and management, right? Because there has to be a little bit of direction in there. I want to try and close with this last question here from Chris Van Eyck. It says, it sort of raises this issue of, how do we deal with this, the sort of the competing of the freedom of access to space, right? The Outer Space Treaty, every country has the right of freedom to use and access space for benefits. But how do we handle that in an area where states also have, under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, responsibility to authorize and provide continuing supervision of their national space activities, and then sort of manage all this stuff? So I don't know, all three of you, if you, or whoever wants to, 30 seconds or so on sort of how you see that balance, and is the kind of open public commons for all in space, at least in the congested orbits, maybe not a great thing?
So one of the interesting aspects of doing a study at the National Academy was that you got to speak to a whole variety of different stakeholders. And we also managed to speak with people both at DoD as well as the White House. At some point, the realpolitik part of this chimes in. And given that the United States is the world's largest space economy, and with the largest number of assets and so on and so forth, the idea is that we get to do whatever we want to do. And by moving early, we get to set the standard and get to set the conversation and get to set the platform on which everybody else gets to play. So that's the attitude that I found, and so this idea of the space treaty that you mentioned itself is sort of an artifact of the 60s, and space was still considered to be a public good. And I think that environment has changed dramatically, as has the sort of thinking at high levels about how to cooperate internationally on these issues.
And I'll throw in there, in the early days of air traffic, pilots were told they couldn't do what they used to do. So people were unhappy because they lost freedom, and that's part of the nature of the steering that Quentin mentioned, of even management, as you say, that you still need to steer, and to me that's control, because if I'm steering the car, hopefully it's going in the direction I'm telling it. But the point is that there is going to have to be some trade-off and some willingness to move the needle on some rules of the road eventually. I think the rules of the road are going to take quite a while. There's going to be a lot of discontent and difficult to get to consensus on these things. That doesn't mean we shouldn't immediately be on that and trying to establish those. There's a number of initiatives that are working to do that and draft up some rules. But ultimately, there is a trade-off there, and I think that some of the people that or organizations that used to occupy some orbits, they will have to back off on some of that in the name of space safety potentially.
Yeah, no, I agree. So we're going to bring this to a close here. Thank you for participating. I just want to make one point at the end here. Sort of, Alice made a great point in the chat about sort of how there's some parallels to some of these concepts. Or sorry, there are some useful concepts in other domains that I think many of us in the space world are probably ignorant of. And one of my sort of hopes is that the space world, as we sort of continue to grapple with this whole space traffic management coordination, fostering non-responsible behavior, how can we learn from how things are done in other domains, concepts, other disciplines? Sujai, you talked about sort of this the broader CPR discussion and economics and the sociology literature. I think that's also really, really useful. So that's sort of what I hope we're doing more of. But also we also kind of need to move a little bit faster here, because SpaceX has 1,000 satellites up. That number is probably going to double in the next year, and they're just one of many that are putting things up there. So with that, I want to join everybody and join me in thanking the panelists for this session, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.